get to what? Listen to music for free, they get videos for free and all of that. And we want that audience, to buy our product, which is news. And it is a struggle because they are just used to getting things and finding their way around the internet much easier than you and me can. Thanks.
But for the piracy situation, for music, because we also have a music business, we've seen how there are entities that actively chase, for royalties, for the usage of this music. Even us, we would have a little bit of a video that we did, and we used some snippet, and we, quickly someone came in and we had to pay. So there is a fair usage, fair pay kind of principle that applies on other IP, and it should also apply to us. Why are we treated differently? Because usage of content that you didn't originate is piracy. For us, I would actually go further and say this is super piracy in my world.
I find it interesting you've referred to music, and we also had someone early in the week talk about the comparison, because for me it's almost in different parts of content things work differently, and even the arrangements between media for content, even if it's redistribute or act as an agency, much like we see with AP and Reuters. But the contracts are very different to what we see with the platforms. And it's not always a revenue share, and maybe it's a copyright issue. But I think that's something we need to think more of, is have we ended up in this world? Because what I think is interesting is just to take and ask you, but Google will come and say, well, they don't monetize Google News. That's great. They don't have to, or they're not. Maybe it's not great, but it has an implication for you, because they're saying if I don't monetize, I'm not. There's nothing I owe you, and you're benefiting from the clicks that you get. So just to the fundamental model, do you think from your experience in other areas, you've got television as well, you appear, I think, on DSTV, but are there lessons that we should be looking for from other fields or areas that might reshape a more sustainable model? Absolutely, Chair. I'll ask Robin to give us his perspective on the legal framework, and then we'll come in.
So, Chair, what we've seen in our build-up to this and facing the tech giants, there is at least precedent in other jurisdictions where the Australian media has reached agreements coincidentally with, I think, this new platform, Google News. We believe that is a precedent. We don't know the terms, but from news reports, the amount seems substantial. So insofar as our content is appearing on those channels, there has been license agreements where they're now admitting to pay for those content. So we would pursue those channels. Those are one of the channels. Insofar as it goes to AI, it has been referred to in this commission, is the New York Times have taken to. So we following a process in that to determine the breadth of our content. As you said, the professor said it's undoubtedly scraped. That would require the AI modules to have a license from us and to pay for those. So ideally, there would be these agreements for the use of our content appearing on those platforms. Insofar as the news content Google News has reached with Australia, so we looking at those legal mechanisms used to achieve that, and we actively pursuing those mechanisms.
Chair, we support the use of technology, but principally we recognize the need to improve on the partnerships to develop sustainable business models on the basis of fair compensation to local content companies. The issue of IP is something that is taken for granted, and we argue strongly that this IP is even worse considering the role that it plays in sustaining and nurturing and supporting our democracy. So this one is vital, in the ranking of many things. And then if you look at the way it is even sourced, because it even sourced on the back of, people even possibly dying, being intimidated, being threatened, being beaten up, being tortured. So this is a special IP that is developed, for the greater public good. It's not just for entertainment. It's not just for humor. It's not just for trivia and the likes. And if you are to look at the contra effect of how we are also treated, Nadeem put it very nicely. We pay Google, and Google take our content, monetizes our content, and stays with the money. So we pay, and then they take our content that we've invested in, and they stay with the money. But on the other side, we have instances where we were sued by some company for the usage of font. A font. We used some just normal Arial, Calibri, things that we normally use on our computer. We put it on a digital thing, and they successfully sued us, and we had to pay. Something as menial as that. But look at the content that we have created that is sitting out there worldwide and globally and everywhere else. So IP in South Africa is such a thing that is trivialized, and it is not taken seriously. On the music side, there's a direct correlation. There's actually a very clear example, because an artist produces a song and it is played on radio. And when it's played on radio, people are listening. That's the audience. And, the radio makes adverts and what have you. But Samro and all those other organizations would basically say, sorry, Radio X, you've played this, this is the X amount of money that you must pay. So there's an equivalent. It's a very simple, clean model that probably as well we should consider, because it talks to recognition. They go even worse. They even take even a sample, a beat. You can also sue for it. So there's precedence, there's learnings, and there's appreciation on this side. Yet radio has been, music has been commoditized, but they haven't given up and rolled over and died. Even the streamers and everybody else, they're coming to the party, they're paying. Why is big tech when it comes to news being treated differently and separately? That we maintain, and we argue that it is patently unfair.
I think the responses that we've seen in the submissions is social media is likely to say, well, you post on my platform. You choose to put your content there. It's not us as like search, scraping it and putting it in the search result. But even Google would say, well, you have the choice to provide a snippet or not. And so I suppose what they're all saying is you have a choice. You're using us for audience reach. So is there a copyright issue? Is there an issue over even fair use?
Except on the issue of Google, we don't really have a choice. They take. Even right now, we had entered into some sort of a discussion with them, and there was some mechanism that we were supposed to, implement. We thought that was going to happen post conclusion of our conversations, but they took our content, and not having asked us, they take it. On social media, you have no choice but to coexist in this space. It will be foolhardy for ourselves to ignore where our audiences are. You know, there is a coexistence. We are not asking to go back to the dark ages where, you know, the only man with, you know, two eyes is the only one who's around or who's able to can see and tell everybody else no. But we still feel that, you know, this content can coexist very well in that space of social media as well as in the space of technology. We have moved with the times, we've adapted, we've had to adapt and follow, you know, changing consumer patterns because our consumers are consuming us differently. And that's what we've tried to do. And we didn't just ordinarily do it. We were coerced and also were attracted and seduced, if I may use those type of words, by the platforms as well to say, you know, you can do this and we can do this and you can get this. So it wasn't just a thing of us waking up and say we're going to plug our content. Actually, there was much resistance, there was much debate about how can, you know, traditional media businesses, you know, continue to compete in this midst of this, you know, digital platforms that are, you know, cropping up everywhere and stuff. But we still argue, I still argue, I'm probably the last man standing. I still argue that South Africa needs a duopoly and a diversity of voices. We cannot leave to inform South Africans on the basis of algorithms. I think that is way dangerous. It's completely dangerous because the person who controls the algorithm is the new form of gatekeeping that comes into the equation, and it's going to significantly erode public trust. It will significantly undermine the quality of the citizen that you're going to have. It takes away the authority and the power of the individual, and it renders the individual, you know, at the mercy of the algorithm.
I think you've raised an interesting point, which I don't think has been raised this week, but how you were seduced but it's interesting to us, I suppose, that very early on in Google's life, it put up Google News. It has put initiatives, obviously, to help journalists and that, but so did Facebook. There was, how do you use our platform? How do we get tools? Which suggests there is obviously value for them too. And I suppose much of the debate we're hearing is, what is the fair share of value? And I just want to go back to something you said in this hearing, but also in your submissions. But you recognize there's some benefit to you from distribution and reach and getting to your audiences now. Maybe the value on the platform side is not always recognized, but it's there. So do you think there is some sort of win-win situation? You know, we heard from a former journalist, Khadija Patel, early in the week that in terms of her role in the International Fund for Public Interest Media, she said the fund is a short-term crisis measure. We need to find ideas for how this can be sustainable in the long run. And so that's a dual mandate they have. So I just want to ask whether you see a win-win solution where you can coexist in a manner that both benefit.
I think in every scenario there's always a win-win opportunity to be discussed and engaged on. But to achieve a win-win scenario, there needs to be willing parties from both sides. And I think it first starts with, and we were talking a lot about other industries, and if you just look at the media industry, there's a code of conduct. There's a certain level of ethics that are applied. You know, if we want Reuters content or if we want AP content, etc., we enter into license agreements or partnerships that clearly outline how this relationship is going to work and for what period it's going to work. So there's definitely opportunities for us to have a win-win, but it comes down to willing parties Number two, it comes down to, I think, transparency on how do we determine this fair value. And I think once you got that going, you are able to then come to that situation where you can get to an equitable, fair value for the content. But if you're going to continue to be in denial of the fact that this content that you are wanting on your platform and people are engaging on your platform is not adding value to your business, that's where the continuous fights are going to happen. But if you can openly and clearly indicate and say, this guy's, there's engagement that happens because of your content. There's a reward for you. There has to be a reward for us because we're creating the content. You know, we go back to the investments that get made in journalists and newsrooms. It runs into the hundreds of millions of rands. And there needs to be a recognition that that content is also benefiting and you need to be rewarded for that content.
And I think, I mean, the theme of transparency keeps coming up, and certainly, I think the earlier comment, I mean, when there is no transparency, you can, in fact, hide a fair amount, and you may wish to hide because revealing it is potentially damaging commercially. I mean, there are obviously commercial secrets, but there's just transparency on other things that is important. I mean, just a last question from me, because we're running out of time, and we do have to also bring in Daily Maverick. But there was a story on Monday from MoneyWeb about that the media had engaged Google. And whilst I'm sure you've been forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement on the details, I mean, can we at least get a sense of why, in your view, did that go nowhere, and we don't have some outcome?
Thank you, James. I wish I could speak freely, but I'm gagged by that NDA. I'll try and speak around it. Those negotiations, I'm just going to speak on behalf of my other fellow publishers. Those negotiations they came at the right time for us. We were actually starting to crumble as a media industry at that particular point in time. We were promised, and in our calculations based on the Australian model and elsewhere, we made some calculations, and there was some good amounts of money based on a very clearly determinable scientific methodology. It was actually we're happy to can subject it to Google and everybody else just to show, because it quantified the amount of content, the value, and whatever, and it arrived at the number. It was simple. So usage, and it talked to those issues of fair value and the likes. We were close to just, happy to quibble about, percentages and the likes, but there was an overwhelming disappointment. We were underwhelmed by the outcome. What was put on the table to what we were expecting was indignant and disappointing and insulting, to say the least. Very disregardful of the hard work that we speak about, that our journalists putting themselves in the line of fire literally to get. We were encouraged by the spirit that at least Google was willing to negotiate, but we were really underwhelmed by what was put on the table, and we walked away.
So do you think, based on your calculations, that South Africa is not valued in the same way as maybe Australia or the Europe?
That was our sense. It was completely disregardful. We were not valued. I think we were looked at just as, again, this third world country that doesn't matter. take it or leave it, because it was a templatized, approach rather than a negotiation that Nadim was referring to, the fair trade, the engagements of saying, okay, let's understand, let's get into an amenable, agreeable position. What were your expectations? How did you arrive at that? We didn't get into those. We just got a number that the system churned out, and it was not the number. It was just go away.
Thank you, Pule, and your team, Nadim, Bongani, and Robin, for coming here. I think you certainly gave us and the public a stark reminder of why journalism is important, and especially important in this country. So thank you for that, and thank you for the insights on the business. And we look forward to the future engagements. And I'm sure some of these questions we can take forward as well with Google, Meta, and others.
Thank you, Chairs. We appreciate the opportunity, Paula and James. Thank you very much. And we stand ready. If there are follow-up questions, we stand ready to answer them as well. Thank you.
And we are going to take I think, 10-minute break till 12:15. And then we'll have the Daily Maverick. That is also a 2-hour slot. And that will end the week's program for the public hearings. Thank you. Welcome back on day 5 of the Media and Digital Platforms Market Inquiry. We're now joined by the Daily Maverick and Styli Charalambous. Welcome and thank you for making time to join us and give the Daily Maverick submissions. So I'm just going to ask you to make your submissions, and then Paul and myself will have questions for you, and I believe Branko will join us later.
Thank you, James, and thank you to the Commission for asking us to participate in these inquiries. We would have liked to have done this in person, but we've already been traveling this week, and our families and the environment appreciate the opportunities to present virtually. I also understand you've heard a lot of testimony and submissions this week, so I hope we can provide new insights today. If we cover anything again that's already been covered in depth, please excuse us. As I said, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Daily Maverick. My name is Styli Charalambous, and we'll be joined by our founder and editor-in-chief, Branko Brikic, who will also be available for questions after this. The format will be, I'll run through questions that were posed to us by the Commission for these submissions into the public hearings, and I'll address them in one go, and I'll be able to respond to them in the format that was provided. I'll start with a brief overview of Daily Maverick's story and a little bit about the evolution of the digital news space. We were founded in October 2009 by Branko Brikic, and we had just 5 people working full-time on the effort back then. The vision was to create the digital reincarnation of Maverick magazine, which was the monthly predecessor to Daily Maverick. It was a glossy monthly with irreverent feature writing, and the vision was to create a digital reincarnation of that as well. We started as a for-profit in the hope that legacy print advertising would move online and we would be able to build a sustainable business off the back of this transition into digital media. We raised investment capital from friends and angel investors in the hope that we would soon break even from advertising sales, but that never happened. But as the years passed, we did grow an audience to the website, and we did this by focusing on providing high-quality feature-length journalism to online audiences and newsletter subscribers. At the time when we were starting out, excuse me, most newspaper publishers focused their efforts on their print publications because that's where all the revenue and profits were being generated from. We didn't have that concern to protect legacy revenue streams, so we could invest all our efforts into digital technologies and platforms without worrying about cannibalizing any of our existing operations because there weren't any to cannibalize. It's been extremely challenging since day one, and the first decade of our existence especially was a miracle that we survived given the market failure that was playing out around us. But even in those tough times, every time we were able to make leaps forward and to make incremental gains, we chose to invest in our newsroom. We could see the impact of the market failing around us, and we understood that we were playing a bigger and bigger role in the defense of truth and the journalism industry itself. We believe journalism should do 2 things. The first is to protect democracy as asked of us by our constitution. And secondly, to help the people of South Africa navigate life. Our vision is that people will know more and know better after consuming our journalism, and we do that with our mission to defend truth. We also believe that for the truth to have impact, it also needs to have reach. So we've chosen not to put up a paywall, and we've rather instead pursued a voluntary membership model. We've learned a lot over the last almost 15 years of being in this business/cause/mission. But we never anticipated how hard it would be to sustain the kind of journalism that we want to create and that we need to create, and the personal toll it's taken on us as founders and our colleagues around us to keep the pursuit going. In our time, we have seen the news industry evolve and shrink simultaneously. digital platforms have broken down the barriers to entry that kept competitors from entering the news market or making inroads into the news market. Every industry experiences disruption, and every organization must innovate or die. Because the news industry with its oligopolies managed to stave off disruption for so long, it came from outside of the industry, and it came for the entire global profession within the space of a decade, which is quite rare. It's clear journalism and the news industry have been disrupted, and news publishers do not have a right to advertising revenue. The question we must ask is whether the disruptors acted in any way that deterred healthy competition, which I guess is why we're here today. We started out as a digital native, and the internet was full of promise back in 2009. There was a sense that a viable business model could be built if advertising budgets moved online, and while not necessarily at the same rate as print per unit in terms of advertising costs, but close enough to be sustainable. That was the hope in which we started this operation. Because Maverick magazine had stopped publishing a year before, Daily Maverick could start as a digital native, but lean on the magazine's reputation in order to build new audiences online. The early years were marked by difficulty in selling online advertising, as back then it only commanded a small portion of advertising budgets and allocations. And of that small portion, that was mostly dominated by large media houses like Media24 with multiple properties, and included the biggest news publisher in the country, News24. In short, it's been an uphill struggle, to put it mildly, for the majority of the 14 and a half years we've been around. There were many months when we as founders would forego salaries and take incredible financial risks to keep the organization afloat. It's clear to us that there is a market failure of journalism, and it has played out. One of the responses to this market failure has been to start a non-profit arm to fund efforts like our investigative journalism, our citizen reporting, and our climate journalism. In 2018, we turned to readers for support with a voluntary membership program, because even the philanthropic side of our efforts wasn't enough to sustain us. You may have already heard about the market for attention and advertising. News publishers have been competing for each of these, sometimes against the same players within the industry, and sometimes against completely foreign actors like the big tech platforms. Because the attention economy is set up to incentivize engagement, and engagement is often fueled by strong emotions, we have seen the news space and the information space, or people presenting themselves as news organizations, pushing extreme views because of these incentives. The other side of the coin is that as news and quality journalism became harder to monetize, less and less labor was being invested in boots on the ground journalism, which in turn made it less attractive to support through reader revenue efforts as well. The rise of aggregators means journalists are now expected to push out 15 pieces of copy a day, rewriting the work of other publications or writing stories based on posts from social media. Neither of these developments has been good for the industry or good for the public at large. The incentives are perverse, contributing to declining trust in the news sector, less public interest journalism being created, and contributing to the overall market failure of journalism. Some of the trends in news media and revenue generation in news media and the ad tech stack now follow. The trends are that South African media is in terrible shape. I'm sure from the submissions you've heard through this week, that has been a theme that has come through quite strongly, not only in South Africa, but journalism around the world is in trouble, experiencing many similar aspects of the impact of the failure of journalism. But we are worse off than most developed markets because of the compounding problems of a failing state, a stagnating economy, and a business sector that doesn't seem interested to help with the unfolding crisis. Before COVID, a report was published estimating the decline of journalist numbers being around 50%. Since then, we have suffered more losses and expected to lose more And so we can probably estimate that around 70% of our industry colleagues have departed from journalism since Daily Maverick started. If you take into account the number of journalists per capita or journalists per economic activity from 20 years ago, we're even worse off when we take these adjustments into account. Revenue generation for most publishers has been about trying to replace lost legacy revenues with digital advertising, and this has been unsuccessful. As a result, many publishers are turning to paywalls as a way to counteract this problem, but that in itself is a problem in the context of a country like South Africa, with the highest unemployment rate in the world and the most unequal society on earth. Our experience with the ad tech stack issue has been somewhat frustrating. We adopted DoubleClick for Publishers as our ad server in around 2010, which had been bought out by Google 3 years earlier. At the time, other ad servers were available. Still, because DoubleClick was offered free to small publishers like ourselves, it would take a lot of work for other ad servers to compete, or startups like ourselves to choose an alternative product that we would need to pay for. DoubleClick allows anyone who sells display advertising on their website to monitor the traffic and the engagement with those advertising campaigns and to report on the efficacy to advertisers. The acquisition of DoubleClick was a masterstroke that allowed Google to dominate the display advertising market, and would eventually be the tool that would allow it to have a stranglehold on pricing. Once we were big enough and able to connect to the advertising exchange, we were able to allow programmatic advertising to be displayed on the site under the premise that better quality demand programmatic advertising could be accessed through these channels. The conundrum here is that programmatic advertising is sold at a much lower price than we could sell directly, but we have all this unsold inventory that we somehow needed to monetize. Without any sight of the upstream mechanics of the programmatic marketplace, we were unsure if Google was somehow channeling higher value advertising to its own properties as being claimed in other jurisdictions that have looked into the antitrust practices of Google. The downside is that as programmatic channels grew in demand through advertisers and media buying agencies, less budget was available for direct buyers, placing more downward pressure on advertising prices per unit. This, coupled with the data available through programmatic channels, meant the downward pressure has only increased over the years. Websites that list their inventory on the open exchange do not see who gets a share of the total spend by buyers on the other side of the inventory that is sold. What that means is if 100 Rand is spent on buying inventory through programmatic channels, some tests have revealed that only 30% of that ends up with the publishers themselves. We don't get to see how all the different players in the value chain take a share of what is ultimately lost on the way to delivering that advertising to publishers. The lack of transparency in the ad tech stack has been extremely frustrating. We don't know the amount of volume traded. We don't know who the beneficiaries are. And even for ads delivered on our site, we also don't know how much ad fraud is taking place and whether market prices are being manipulated as is being claimed in lawsuits around the world. Can you imagine a stock exchange operating in a similar fashion where you offer to sell something, but you don't know who is profiting off your offer, or whether the person acting on the exchange whether the person acting as the exchange is acting in your best interest because they're also acting as the broker and buying and selling their own stocks at the same time? There's no scenario in the world in which we would allow an exchange like this to operate. So why are we doing that with such a big industry as digital advertising? The lack of quality controls by both Google and Facebook allows bad actors to advertise on their networks with pretty much impunity. We saw this play out, how democracies have been hacked in Brexit and US elections in particular, because of the ability to target. It is impossible to see who is delivering what advert with what kind of message to certain people. It's hard to track if someone is delivering a lie and paying to promote that using these systems. Even today, you can jump onto YouTube and see AI-generated versions of Elon Musk or Trevor Noah encouraging people to join Ponzi schemes. These platforms have been allowed to get away with egregious lack of quality control for fraudulent and bad actor advertisers to play in their space. In traditional media, and even with the likes of digital natives like ourselves, we have to vet advertisers. And if something slips through the net, reader complaints would alert us to responding and to taking these things down. If you've ever reported any of these ads on YouTube, Facebook, X, or Instagram, you'll know what a fruitless effort this is to have any kind of response to these things, to these bad actor advertisements. Again, one can only surmise that there's no real incentive to clamp down on this because of their dominant market position and that they earn massive amounts of revenue from bad actors themselves. If there were healthy competition and a healthier market, this would be damaging to their brand as a destination, and they would be more likely to act. One last example worth mentioning is the failed project Accelerated Mobile Pages by Google that was released a few years back. I think this was around 2015 or so. Accelerated Mobile Pages was supposed to speed up and improve the mobile experiences for publishers by serving a lean version of a web page from Google's service instead of our own. Because of the speed, the experience would be better for readers and more advertising could be generated because page speed does indeed equate to longer session times, which equates to more advertising revenue. However, the project was canned after a few years as it was discovered that ads were indeed faster on AMP, after it was discovered that AMP was indeed faster, but only because they were slowing down the delivery of non-AMP pages to make AMP seem faster. This was claimed as one of the biggest reasons alongside data and privacy, which contributed to low adoption rates. But these are the kinds of practices that we have had to endure over the years. In terms of news consumption in South Africa and how it's changed since digitalization, consumption has definitely changed on multiple levels in the move to digital. For example, the newspaper has been unbundled from what we used to know. People were previously offered a basket of journalism and adjacent content, all of which has now been broken down into individual bits and consumed on smaller devices. The impact of all these factors is that most people only click on those items that strongly interest them. And a feature of the transition is that bad actors have been able to hijack this and manipulate the attention for gains, monetary and otherwise. The majority of traffic we see nowadays is sideways, which means it is accessed through a link on social or search or shared links and not directly to our homepage or our newsletters. Our single largest channel these days is Google Discover, and combined with Google Search, this brings in more than 50% of the traffic to our site. We have never seen major traffic from Facebook or X, and luckily we never came to depend on them. So when the big algorithm changes happened, we weren't that affected as some of our other colleagues. This has advantages and disadvantages. The reliances on algorithms means you have no insight into the mechanics of what drives these referrals or how quickly things might change in future. The advantages are that you can get significant amount of traffic if you work hard at promoting and curating and optimizing pages for these distribution channels. In terms of reader attention spans, we are definitely seeing shorter attention spans with many people bouncing off articles before reaching even halfway. A lot of people also only browse headlines and retain just a superficial understanding of news events. If people mainly get their news from social media, it's often hard to distinguish opinion from reporting and to distinguish agenda-driven people or bots looking to influence others from good quality journalism. Again, in this democratization of the information space, a person in their bedroom commenting or providing their opinion on news events is valued by the market as much as and has the potential to travel further than a professionally created piece of journalism. This can be both good and bad. it's important here to distinguish between content and journalism. Content can be anything made by anyone, but journalism has processes and standards that it needs to follow before.
Welcome back, Stilly. Apologies, we've not had a good day for tech. And it's been all the sporting infrastructure, I think, that's let us down. But I think you were talking about the sort of shorter attention spans and the consumer behavior. You just talked about the rise of Google Discover and various other things. So if we could pick up there.
Yeah, did I start? Did you manage to get anything about the business model? I think I may have started moving on to that.
No, we haven't.
Did you?
Why don't you start with that?
Okay. All right, great. Is everything good to go, James? Can we kick off from here?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, great. So I'll pick up a little bit about the business model and the rationale for choosing the different strategies that we have with regards to monetization. I mentioned earlier we started out as a for-profit with aspirations of becoming a mostly advertising and sponsorships-driven business. We hypothesized that advertising spend from traditional channels would migrate to digital, and that trusted publications would become and compete for a fair share of advertising market spend. We believe that attracting a desirable audience to our site and keeping them engaged with high quality and long form journalism would attract advertisers seeking to reach those audiences. But that didn't work out as planned, and that meant having to start a public benefit organization in order to access philanthropy, especially around investigative journalism. And with our work on the Gupta leaks in 2016 and 2017, we were able to kick things off there. But even that wasn't enough to sustain us, as the amount of philanthropy in South Africa on the whole is limited, and even less so for journalism in particular. This is why in 2018, we launched a voluntary membership program to keep our journalism free, even for those who can't afford to pay, while being able to access financial support from our readers. We believe this is especially important in a country like South Africa because of the high employment rate and the inequality that we experience. I mentioned earlier, for the truth to have impact, it also needs to have reach. And so the voluntary membership model works well for us because it allows us to pursue the vision of know more, know better, which deals with our mission to defend truth. We need the full range of financial support from philanthropy, commercial advertising and sponsorships, and reader revenue to try sustain ourselves and to try and grow through these tough conditions. To our knowledge, in the time that we've been going, we've created more jobs in journalism than any other single publisher, with the now 100 or so people that we employ. I used to think this was a minor miracle given the circumstances, but on reflection, I can think we can upgrade that to a major one. Our views on revenue models in digital news distribution and the reasons for not adopting a paywall, I mentioned some of these earlier, but let me elaborate on some of the similarities and differences between the different types of reader revenue models that a news publisher can pursue. The full extent of these is wide-ranging. You can start off from donations to memberships and different kinds of memberships to paywalls and different kinds of paywalls. Within that, each publisher needs to determine which model works best for them, taking into account various factors, including how they're funded, the vision and mission, the political and competitive environment. There are similarities across these types of reader revenue, but the one thing that is constant is that news publishers need to be creating journalism that is worth paying for. The difference is how you ask and execute each form of different paywall or reader support through each publication's strategies. In our estimation, paywalls are easier to implement than a voluntary membership program that we've adopted, because you can simply put up an access controlled gate preventing access to articles and through to journalism. Membership is about more than access. It is about building a community around the relationship with news publishers rather than just paying for access to content and journalism. When you do not restrict access to journalism, you give it a much stronger, you need to have a much stronger cause for people to buy into, and often it's because it's the right thing to do. For paywalls to be successful, publishers need to have journalism worth paying for, and it requires an investment in the newsroom. Before, the newsroom was seen in many publishers as a cost center. People came to the idea that the product is journalism and not just the ad spaces beside that. The pursuit of reader revenue has had one big impact, and that has been people understanding that in order for the readers and the public to dip into their wallets to support, we need to invest in our newsrooms again. Membership sits in the middle of donations and paywalls. Donations are simply financial transactions with no expectation of anything in return, and paywalls, as I've mentioned, are a gate on access to journalism. Membership has made us, I believe, better news publishers and has greater retention rates than most paywalls that we see around the world. So we're happy with our decision, as well as being able to keep our journalism free for those who can't afford to pay. Because it is cause-driven and because we spend so much time on engagement and building a community, we also see much higher retention rates in our membership model than many retention rates we see from paywall publishers around the world. So while fewer people join at a slower rate than, let's say, a paywall model, we are seeing people stick to membership much longer and with more stickiness than most paywall models we see around the world. If we had chosen a paywall model, however, we wouldn't be able to access as much philanthropy as we do, and it would go in the face of our vision, which is for people to know more and to know better. We also understand in a country like South Africa, it would be a great disservice to society if journalism was only available to the benefit of a select few who could pay. The rationale for the effectiveness of the initiatives and the campaigns to improve engagement and maintain sustainability. As a startup, you have to try many, many different things to be sustainable. This includes events, display advertising, e-commerce, native advertising, custom publishing, book publishing, documentaries, video and advertising, affiliate revenue, etc. The list goes on, and we've tried many of those in our pursuit of being sustainable. We've settled on three major categories of revenue for ourselves: philanthropy, commercial advertising and sponsorships, and finally, reader revenue. It's our view that a general news publisher, especially with a national focus and with ambitions of serving the country at large, needs at least three categories of revenue and ideally 6 individual revenue streams to be sustainable, a minimum of those. Our migration from a for-profit to a hybrid organization helped fuel our growth, and the latest piece was adding the membership model 5 years ago. Having the consistent and recurring financial support of readers has been a game changer for us. It's allowed us to continue to invest any gains in our newsroom and other supporting areas of the business to fuel even more growth. We owe this to our foundational commitment to pursuing public interest journalism that creates value in people's lives, which attracts philanthropy and readers to support us. Sometimes we have to be explicit in communicating how that value is created for readers, and you may have seen some of our regular written appeals asking readers to join our membership program and to join the cause. Growing the membership program has been the cornerstone of surviving these turbulent times. Still, there have been occasions when philanthropy and soft loans from shareholders and other supporters have helped us through difficult times, most recently in COVID, and now as things have become tougher. Many people have asked us why we still choose a growth path when we could be profitable. And our answer to this is because as we've recognized the market failure of journalism in South Africa and around the world, we've seen the severe job losses of our colleagues and the impact that it has on society. This is why we need to continue to invest in filling this gap, even though this continues to put a strain on our financial security and peace of mind. As a national publication with a general focus on news and producing long-form original journalism, we have traditionally attracted readers where this national agenda has resonated, and that means people from Gauteng and the Western Cape have traditionally made up the biggest portion of our audiences. As a South African publication, the vast majority, 90% or so of our readers are South African based. As a publisher of long-form journalism, we've attracted a highly educated and urban audience, which now reaches around 10 million monthly unique visitors. While certain articles or specific products have a target audience in mind, we focus on key themes that are important to all South Africans in pursuit of our vision and mission and what we believe journalism is for. As a digital publisher, we can attract audiences from many different parts of the open web, but we find that because of the topics we cover, mostly adults gravitate to our work. Some channels like newsletters might attract more formally employed people or business persons, while our newspaper caters to an older generation of people who grew up using and now still prefer that medium to consume their news. We desire to reach younger audiences, as many news publishers do, and this is where shorter form versions of our work and a multimedia strategy come into play, especially when disseminated on social media, where the monetary model for doing so is not yet obvious. We pursue a strategy of trying to reach younger audiences and investing in multimedia content on social distribution channels, even without understanding where the monetization might come from, because we feel we have a duty to combat mis and disinformation in the void of factual reporting on social media and to build a brand with younger audiences who might change behaviors later on. We sometimes joke that we wait for them to become older and grumpier and start receiving mortgage statements and email when they might change their behaviors and come directly to us. Daily Maverick's views on investigative journalism, the challenges and the costs. Investigative journalism is a craft that needs to be honed over years. One simply does not become a good investigative journalist overnight, despite what some editors at other publications might tell you. The first sustainability issue is that we simply don't have enough journalists and investigative journalists for the size of problems that we have in our country. South Africa, for the levels of corruption that we have, is woefully understaffed in journalism and especially in the investigative field. We don't have enough people wanting to become journalists, and we have lost an entire generation of those who were in the industry, leaving for more pay and less risk and changing careers or retiring early. Investigative journalism is costly to produce. It can take months for a single story to be published, and often once published, you may be threatened with legal action afterwards that needs to be defended, incurring further costs, and in some extreme cases, additional security measures are needed to protect journalists and whistleblowers. Due to the market failure of journalism, the value of investigative journalism articles in the current open market economics is valued as the same as a piece of content that can be created by anyone with an internet connection. I've done some rough calculations using some of the Gupta Leaks articles that we produced, where we published over 70 exposés, and using existing open exchange rate CPMs and an average of 50,000 page views per story, we worked out a rough cost of around 1,500 Rand each for these articles. It's just crazy for the amount of work and the amount of investment and the impact that those stories had, that the open market values it at such a low number. It's clear that there is a market failure of journalism where the economics of the service no longer work, but there's still massive value being created by the service that is being delivered to the public. Part of the problem is that journalism, and specifically public interest journalism, is a public good that benefits society as a whole, even if you as an individual don't use it. So just like parks, roads, clean water, and other public goods, without public interest journalism, we would be worse off as a society, and significantly worse off if the remaining tenets of journalism would disappear, which is what we're currently facing. I would argue that the remaining functioning elements of democracy would disappear with public interest journalism. We only need to look at the decline of governance and service delivery in our cities and the correlating decimation of local accountability journalism to see how democracy and public institutions die in lockstep with the decimation of journalism. Over the years, we have competed for advertising revenues, reader revenues, and other parts of the digital ecosystem. And I would like to take this opportunity to speak about the cost of mis and disinformation to society and newsrooms in particular. In our opinion, Meta is the largest enabler of the spread of mis and disinformation through platforms that they own, including Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. And it takes the toll on society and newsrooms in the following way. In this context, we must take note of these platforms' resistance to dealing with this problem and the inadequate allocation of resources to solving this problem, despite making obscene profits quarter after quarter and year after year. The first of these problems, or the impact of this, is the erosion of public trust. When misinformation and disinformation spreads unchecked, it erodes the public's trust in credible news sources. People start questioning the authenticity of all news, which makes the job of legitimate newsrooms like ours even harder. The skepticism towards news source demands more effort from newsrooms to reestablish and maintain credibility, redirecting resources that could be used elsewhere. It also makes growing reader revenue a harder task than it is already if there's a lack of trust in news organizations. Another is the increased burden on fact-checking. Newsrooms are increasingly forced to allocate time, money, and human resources to fact-checking information that's been widely circulated on these platforms. This diverts resources away from investigative journalism, feature writing, and other core journalistic endeavors, potentially diluting the quality and the depth of original reporting from other important areas. It's a question of resource allocation, but one that has to be done, given that these platforms are not taking responsibility for combating this themselves. Hijacking of advertising tools by bad actors. I mentioned earlier on that this is a huge problem for not only us, but for the public as well. But platforms like Facebook and Instagram offer sophisticated targeting tools that unfortunately can be misused by bad actors to spread misinformation, lies, or other agendas. These actors can tailor misleading content to vulnerable or susceptible audiences, manipulating public opinion under the guise of legitimate advertising. This not only manipulates people, but also dilutes the value of digital advertising, exacerbating financial pressures on newsrooms. Cloned websites and ad revenue leakage. The proliferation of cloned or mimicked websites replicating reputable news outlets to push false narratives is another facet of this issue. These cloned sites are marketed through adverts that run on these platforms and are monetized through ads that display on these platforms, drawing revenue away from what could have potentially gone to legitimate news sources. This contributes to diluting the advertising market, putting additional downward pressure on advertising rates for genuine news publishers. But moreover, these ads on these mimic sites can mislead readers into thinking they're engaging with credible journalism, further muddying the waters of the information ecosystem. The impact on ad revenue is that when platforms allow misinformation and disinformation to spread, they can also siphon off advertising revenue that could have gone to news organizations. Advertisers may place ads with more engagement, regardless of the content's veracity. The financial pressure further strains newsroom budgets, making it hard to fund comprehensive journalism. The lack of accountability on major social platforms contributes to the market failure in journalism. When misinformation and disinformation is rampant and unchecked, it distorts the information ecosystem, making it challenging for quality journalism to compete on a level playing field. The resources newsroom must spend fighting misinformation could have been used elsewhere in creating investigative journalism or the news gathering process and other critical functions that contribute to a healthy democracy. Polarization and a societal divide are another aspect where misinformation can deepen these divides, fostering polarization. This creates an environment where people are less open to dialogue and understanding, making journalists' role of informing and educating the public even more challenging. Attempting to solve this problem as a publisher diverts resources away from other critical areas is something that we have mentioned over again. One example I would like to relay to the Commission is in the KZN riots of July 2021, our editor-in-chief was part of a global task force of editors and representatives from major tech platforms set up to combat disinformation. As the riots were kicking off, certain accounts on Twitter were openly driving hate speech and fueling the rioters' actions. After notifying the Twitter representatives who sat on this task force of the offending accounts, they refused to take any action against these people or shut down any of these offending accounts. It's unsurprising that X has decided not to participate in these hearings based on our interactions with them. It once again shows that these task groups are sometimes set up in a farcical and superficial nature, and how zero accountability is given to how these tools are used to incur great cost to life and property with no recourse. This barely touches on the mental health impact that many studies have shown that these platforms have in affecting young people in particular, leading to serious issues including self-harm, depression, anxiety, and other ailments. If social media use contributes to the decline of mental health, those people are unlikely to become healthy consumers of factual news and journalism. They're more likely to be caught in a trap of online abuse and echo chambers of negative reinforcement content. In essence, the unchecked spread of misinformation, disinformation on major social platforms and their unwillingness to dedicate more resources to combating this problem undermines the social fabric and imposes tangible costs on newsrooms, diverting away precious resources from our core mission of delivering truthful impact journalism to society. Competing against big tech and social media companies for people's attention is a complex issue. First, we must acknowledge that Daily Maverick was aided in reaching the audience size it has with the resources we had by using these distribution channels afforded by digital platforms. However, one might argue that if the market economics were better, we would have had a marketing budget ourselves to spend on distribution in an alternate universe. From the examples mentioned above, it's clear that the combined lack of transparency in dominant market positions has allowed these platforms to act with impunity when degrading the social fabric and the advertising ecosystem from operating in a healthy manner. The downward pressure on advertising rates does not affect these dominant players, because even when individual rates are depressed and there isn't healthy competition, there's little incentive to clean up issues like ad fraud and the spread of misinformation, because they'll just make more of smaller amounts as market dominant players. Our views on how to mitigate the effects of perceived market failure in the news industry Well, it's always been that journalism is the product or the service that we're offering, and growing and investing in that service makes more sense. Some organizations still reliant on legacy advertising models or revenue streams may see the newsroom as a cost center rather than the lever by which to enable financial support from readers. We've also always tried to maintain a culture of innovation, where as a startup, we were willing to and had to experiment with new ways of doing things. As I mentioned, we didn't have those legacy revenues to protect, so we could go all in on digital, where others grappled with and still do digital transformation of their businesses. I want to refer to a discussion paper that was released in 2010 and initiated by the Federal Trade Commission of the United States into the risk of the failure of the news industry. In that discussion paper, Google submitted that the business problems of news require business solutions and not regulatory interventions, which were being contemplated at the time. That was 14 years ago, and the situation is now much worse. It's clear that business solutions will not fix the failure of journalism, of the journalism market, especially when the market is dominated by two players in this country and in most parts of the world. It is our view that policy interventions and reforms are the only thing that can save the media from collapse. Those who spoke out against possible measures and interventions that were recommended in those FTC hearings should be having second thoughts about their objections, because the discussions never went anywhere beyond that into anything actionable, and 14 years have been wasted. In our view, the market failure of journalism is a complex issue and requires a multifaceted approach. Firstly, we need to do better ourselves. We need better leaders in our news organizations. As an industry, we have not invested in developing the kinds of leaders required to run modern news organizations. As much as the market failure around us has played out, our industry lacks the entrepreneurs and innovators required to work through these outrageously challenging times. We need to make huge amounts of investments in professional development if we were to address this part of the multifaceted problem. Secondly, we need to create more jobs to create the generational talents that have been lost from journalism in the last 15 years. Newsrooms have been juniorized and institutional memories have been sculpted. We need to find a way through policy reform in order to help us create new jobs. We also need to attract more young people into the industry who believe that there's a viable career for them in journalism and the services around journalism. The market failure deters ambitious people from joining journalism or any of these careers around journalism, even in a time when so many young people are looking for purpose in their work, and journalism offers this in many, many spades. Next, we also need to attract more product and technology people into journalism, understanding that the competition for this type of talent puts us squarely in the fight for these people against big business and big tech as well. We need ways that can help us do this, because we currently struggle to do so. We also desperately need regulatory and policy reform to improve the environment in which public interest journalism operates. We've heard in these hearings that the Constitution and the Constitutional Court have clarified the important role that journalism plays in protecting our rights and democracy. We hear time and time again about the special job that we are supposed to do, and yet there are no special consequences or support frameworks to help us do this job. We have written about 10 laws that we feel could be implemented that could make a huge difference in our world to create an environment that supports the industry. These policy measures stem from local and international research, as well as taking cues from measures that have been implemented in other countries to support the industry through COVID and in a response to the market failure. These include tax incentives to encourage wider support from public, from businesses, investors, and the state to support journalism. These incentives are important because we still want to reward quality and those who create more value for society. We want to be able to still lean on a demand-driven approach to supporting those who do well. Some of these examples include zero rating reader revenue for VAT in South Africa, making subscriptions and membership contributions tax deductible, offering depreciation allowances for investors who invest in media, zero rating data charges on mobile devices to news publishers so that it's easier for the public to access quality information, compensating whistleblowers and investigative media as a percentage of assets recovered or fines imposed from their work, and offering advertising rebates for businesses to support journalism. Donations, regardless of PBO status or vehicle, should be made tax deductible and tax efficient to news publishers. And all of this is predicated on being a Press Council member in good standing, which would increase the value of Press Council membership, which would allow them to raise their fees and employ more people in being a regulator and an ombud. Finally, we need those who benefit from our work to help sustain our work. This includes businesses in South Africa who have received a free pass as some of the main beneficiaries, and big tech companies that employed questionable practices to achieve market dominance and play a rent extractive role in our economy. We believe the best way to implement this is not by using copyright laws or payments for links, as some countries have pursued. We believe that this can be done using the concept of an environmental rehabilitation charge to be levied on those who have extracted billions from our economy and benefit from the lack of transparency. Just as when a river or a piece of land is damaged by corporate or with questionable business practices, rehabilitation charges can be levied on those who benefit from these market circumstances. If we accept that journalism is a public good and that it has been damaged by untoward business practices, then the rehabilitation framework might be a good way in which to assess this. In our view, a charge for past damages and an annual rehabilitation fee would be appropriate, linked to revenue or profit, with a minimum charge and a minimum rehabilitation period of 10 years. This could also apply to any new platforms who come in and engage similar practices of lack of accountability, poor quality control of advertisers, and poor quality control around the spread of mis and disinformation, and who generate revenue above a certain amount. Finally, just to touch on the competition between Daily Maverick and other news organizations. In our early years, many of our news publisher competitors were far better at getting reach on social media, especially platforms like Facebook. It was something we couldn't properly crack, and we instead focused on growing direct relationships with our readers through newsletters and driving traffic to our homepage. This performance on Facebook was a stroke of luck, as we never became reliant on them. And so when the big algorithm changes happened, we weren't really affected. We'd also in the interim grown our newsletter base, which became a meaningful source of advertising revenue and eventually members. News publishers should try to optimize their pages for search accessibility. This involves making pages render as fast as possible, optimizing headlines, and including metadata for search crawlers. After that, there's very little control for publishers on how to influence search traffic, although some publishers will look to trends on social media or search results and then write articles in response to that. It is dangerous to run an editorial strategy purely on what is spiking on social media, and very rarely converts into the kind of journalism that readers will pay for. These are cheap clicks that can only be monetized through cheap programmatic ads. Because search and other Google products like Discover are important sources of traffic, it is a key part of our decision-making in how we optimize our efforts without ever compromising our vision or our editorial standards. We have found that having a new strategy that caters to the needs of society works best in the long run. Some products can reward it and can convert readers into financial supporters. We do not have access to other news publisher analytics, and even if we did, I doubt we would change our approach. We have a vision, we work to understand the needs of the South African public, and we work hard to create journalism that society needs, not necessarily what they want. We must work hard to make journalism more attractive, though, and palatable to many more consumers of news, whether that includes short formats like summaries or videos in attracting younger audiences. I do also want to spend just a quick moment to talk about click fraud and ad fraud and how it's identified and its impact on the news industry. Click fraud happens when someone or something like a bot clicks on online ads with malicious intent rather than genuine interest. This can be done to deplete a competitor's advertising budget by consuming their paid-for clicks without any chance of conversion, or artificially inflating revenue for the website hosting the ads. What this looks like, you'll see unusually high click rates with low conversion rates, and this can indicate that many clicks are not from genuinely interested users or humans at all. Clicks are from suspicious locations or IP addresses can create repeated clicks from the same IP address or location that don't match target audiences, might also indicate fraud, and patterns of activity that don't match human behavior at all can suggest bot activity as well. How it's identified, advertisers and platforms should be using detection mechanisms, including the following: analyzing click-through patterns, detecting anomalies, monitoring IP addresses, and employing machine learning algorithms to distinguish legitimate from fraudulent click patterns. Despite the many resources available to big tech platforms, despite the advancements in AI, and despite the huge amounts of data held by these companies, some studies put the prevalence of ad fraud as in $1 in every 3 spent of all digital advertising. If I refer back to the stock exchange scenario, can you imagine a comparable scenario on a financial exchange where, for example, a third of all the shares traded were fraudulent transactions on non-existent companies? We simply wouldn't allow that. The impact on the digital news ecosystem is that this becomes a financial drain for publishers and advertisers. Click fraud and other forms of ad fraud can drain budgets on useless clicks, reducing the funds available for legitimate ad placements on reputable news sites. For publishers, it can mean even more reduced ad revenue due to lower trust from advertisers and potential penalties from ad networks on fraudulent activity, even if unintentional. Advertisers losing trust in the digital space due to click fraud might cut back on their online spending. That includes cutbacks on legitimate news sites. This reduces revenue again. That hurts the environment and the ability to produce and distribute quality news content. Both advertisers and publishers have to invest in sophisticated anti-fraud measures, diverting resources again from content creation, innovation, and enhancing the user experience. Click fraud muddies the digital advertising waters, making it harder for genuine news sites to create the content and secure the visibility and funding it deserves. It's a persistent issue that adds to more challenges that newsrooms face, and one where we have very little control. For organizations building virtual worlds and teaching computers how to see and think and reason, one has to question the lack of progress in clamping down on ad fraud. This may be because as owners of the entire channel, they still make the same amount of revenue whether fraudulent ads are run and clicked on as opposed to real ads. Before the advent of ads.txt, which added an extra layer of verification to websites, it was easy for fake websites to pose as brand name publishers and steal their revenue by pretending to be them. In a test run by The Guardian in 2016, it was found that without the use of ads.txt, other publishers or other fake websites were stealing revenue from The Guardian by offering lower rates and being able to divert advertising away from The Guardian website, even when media buyers were choosing to place those ads on The Guardian. Again, we don't know if the demand-side buyers these days use ads.txt in all their placements, and we don't know if the platforms enforce this when buying through exchanges. Again, the lack of transparency makes it hard for us to do anything about this problem. Because of the market failure of journalism, there are limited funding opportunities for news publishers. Few investors are keen on the risk associated with media investments, and traditional development finance and social impact investors and ESG investors do not even have the media sector on the radar. Corporate advertisers are getting less and less supportive of the news industry, and only a few philanthropies support journalism as a whole, with some pulling out of journalism and some pulling out of South Africa completely. In reality, we are competing for funding scraps across all these sources, and some estimates put us at less than 5% of digital advertising budgets these days. As the market failure of news plays out, the pool of philanthropy and developmental finance becomes smaller and smaller. as the biggest news market crumbles, and I'm referring to the United States of America, less philanthropic support of the media is available. With the war in Ukraine, there's less for Africa. Less than 0.2% of all overseas development aid goes to journalism, and of that amount, intermediary organizations take the bulk of that, and so even less ends up is available for actual creation of journalism. We recently saw the launch of Pluralis, a fund created to support Eastern European news publishers from blended sources of grants, development finance, and retail bonds to offer low-cost growth and sustainable finance for news organizations. That is the extent of market failure that Europe has had to resort to putting these kinds of measures in place. We have to ask, what about Africa? The primary defense against, and to talk a little bit now about the impact of corporate and government-funded streams on investigative journalism and editorial policies. The primary defense against influencing editorial output of a newsroom is the culture and standards that a newsroom practices day in and day out. It is not a given that a newsroom's independence is automatically compromised simply by taking revenue or funding from corporations or even the government directly. Certainly, when these become too dominant and when a single source is responsible for most of the funding or the revenue, the risk of complications increases, and we have seen this in many examples before. We highly recommend to any newsroom of having a diversified stream of revenue and funding sources, especially the larger a newsroom becomes. Some newsrooms won't accept corporate funding whatsoever, and others like Daily Maverick have sold advertising since day one, and we pride ourselves on the independence of our newsroom. The threats to the industry are escalating and getting worse. I mentioned even the USA, with the world's largest economy and then largest news industry, is experiencing an existential crisis with job losses coming out week after week and publishers closing down. We truly are facing the consequences of a failed market, and one that was identified over a decade ago. A position that has only been made worse by the practices of big tech and the lack of adequate policy measures and a lack of support from the public and business sectors. I want to end with a special note on the Google News initiative. I know some of my colleagues who have made submissions here before have berated the efforts of the Google News initiative as a charity intended to placate us, and maybe this is a cynical view that we also once had. But I do want to acknowledge the importance of their effort. Google themselves understood the importance of the news industry to society and to their business model by establishing the Google News initiative that would support the industry in a number of ways. This included funding innovation projects and building tools that would be helpful to the news industry. As a beneficiary of 2 Google News innovation grants and the positive impact they have had on our offerings and our sustainability, I can attest to the worthwhile and meaningful efforts that the GNI has had in the space. While one may argue that in a fairer world, news publishers could have and should have been able to afford our own innovation programs, it's not a given that we would have thought about that consciously and specifically about the projects that we undertook as a result of these innovation grants. We are not an industry known for innovation, and we certainly did not show that before the digital disruption hit the global news industry. Many aspects of journalism and South African life can be considered a paradox. The relationship between Google and news publishers is just another one in our world. We have to think of Google as a nation state with different provinces. One province, the GNI program, is committed to the betterment of the news industry, while other provinces are happy to chase profits without consideration for the impact on society or the news industry. We have met, interacted with, and worked with many employees of the GNI program. Often, many of them have come from a background of working in journalism, and we consider allies in the sustainability of news. However, as litigation rises around the world, there is rising tension within the organization about how much budget is allocated to the GNI program and the return on investment of supporting the news industry. We must also acknowledge that we are individuals in having benefited from the Google News Initiative program, and that is not across the board. In closing, I think one way to sum up our submission is to look at Google's motto, which is currently organizing the world's information. Without a healthy journalism sector, there is a real risk that this can easily become organizing the world's disinformation. I also do not want the focus to fall squarely on Google because of their dominance in the advertising value chain and the display advertising chain through programmatic channels. Meta, as the main enabler of mis and disinformation, is also responsible for a huge cost on society and the news industry because of the above mentioned elements of how that costs society and the news industry and the impact on businesses. Thank you.
Thanks, Dilly, and I see, Branko, you've joined us too. Welcome. Thank you for making the time. I know, like all publishers, you're under-resourced and overstretched, and so we appreciate making the time.
My apologies, just to clarify, I had a dental surgery, so it was a slightly different reason. I apologize for being late.
Not at all, Branko, not at all. I mean, I think both of us feel there's so much information in the submission and so much to unpack, and that is a challenge. But maybe, Stilly and Branko, maybe if I can just start with almost trying to structure it, because so the first thing I think is maybe as the economist here, you know, I get drawn into things like market failure and aspects. But I suppose that the way you're framing it as a market failure is that this is not going to turn around. The way the market has shifted and its dynamics mean that journalism is unsustainable. And as you pointed out, Silly, I mean, the numbers of journalists are coming down. We've heard this week that many, even of our biggest news properties in the country, are loss-making. But would that be a fair assessment? I mean, in your view, because of the way the market sits at the moment, this genuinely is existential crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It is existential. If we look at all the data that's coming out of South Africa, if we look at the United States, which is a much bigger market and has a lot more data on this and conducts a lot more research into this, we see the trends are similar. And if the United States is talking about an existential crisis, then, you know, we're in an even worse shape. I also just want to clarify one thing as well, is that when we talk about a market failure and an industry that's being disrupted, and I talked about every industry being disrupted and every industry and every organization having to deal with disruption and having to innovate. We're not seeing this as a normal sort of creative destruction of a product that is no longer valuable. I used the example of in a recent article that I wrote around how Kodak, as the dominant manufacturer of photography film, and what it went through, we ended up with a better product in digital photography, and so that was normal creative destruction moving to a better place. What we're seeing with the market failure of journalism is that even as it's being disrupted, journalism is still highly valuable to society, especially public interest journalism. So there is still value that's there, that's being created. But what we're seeing is that the economics no longer work. And on top of that, we're seeing newspaper publishers and their digital spin-offs like Daily Maverick, for example, who create the bulk of the public interest journalism, who have been more affected by the failing market than, let's say, broadcast publishers of news, for example.
And I suppose I just want to try and pack with you the different components. You know, funnily enough, our guidance in a market inquiry are market features that that may adversely affect not just competition, but the purpose of the Act, which has a broader purpose. But we can split it up between structure, outcomes, and conduct as well. But I suppose that where I'd just like your help. I mean, we've moved digital. People are consuming news digitally, and there's probably been an explosion in digital inventory as well for advertising. And those are maybe irreversible trends. That's the world we're going to be living in. I suppose what one has to unpack is, are there features of this market either in the conduct of Google and Meta, as you set out, or just features in how things work, such as with social media, because people can post, it's vulnerable to misinformation. And with the world of programmatic advertising, I mean, on that, you say it doesn't value the same, and they value the same, the quality content and the other. But is that a feature of programmatic advertising by its very nature, or is that a product of incentives or other conduct that that has occurred?
It is. I think if we just look at the world of digital advertising and we look at some of the basics of, I guess, supply and demand, the minute we offer way more digital inventory, obviously the rate per unit is going to come down because that's just simple supply and demand economics. What we have to question, though, is the practices in and around that system that have made the price pressures or the dropping of those prices even worse than they would be normally. And so this is where things like not being more proactive about shutting down ad fraud, because the more ad fraud that is allowed in the marketplace, the more price pressure on that, because ad fraud dilutes the value of those of the individual prices. It takes ad revenue away from legitimate publishers, and if you own the market, you still make money off those fraudulent ads, as one example. The other one is, we simply don't know where the other 70% of the value goes when a transaction is transacted in the marketplace. We also don't know if the people who control the auctions are channeling demand to their own exchanges, or are channeling demand to their own properties that generate ad revenue. All of these things contribute to a worsening environment. And so, yes, it is true that the minute you add more supply in the digital space, that you are going to get less cost per unit. These other things make it even worse. And then also we mentioned the impact of mis and disinformation and the financial cost that it has by eroding trust, which means people are less likely to trust news publications or become a healthy news consumer. Or if someone for example watches a YouTube video or hears a WhatsApp voice note about the dangers of the vaccine, and Daily Maverick publishes articles going on about that the vaccine is safe and that the Council of South African Scientists have said it's all good and whatever it is, those consumers are going to be less likely to A, read us, and B, become a financial supporter, because there's this distrust. So all these other practices in and around it have exacerbated what the normal supply demand impact would be on the ecosystem. And without any transparency to all of this, they've been allowed to carry on and pursue without any recourse. The other one is obviously moderation on what happens on their platform, and not having the cost that is associated with maintaining or fighting this mis and disinformation, which we do for example. We have processes that, that prevent that stuff from going out, right? They don't have to have quality controls. They get all the benefit from free user-generated content, but they have none of the requisite costs in maintaining the standards or preventing hate speech from happening, or preventing genocide, or the platforms being used for genocide, or preventing fraudulent advertisers from pushing lies that can affect democratic functions and elections. And so when you have all of that, then all those things together negatively affect the individual price per unit of digital advertising, but also what then gets allocated towards legitimate publishers who have all these costs, but none of the benefits that the big tech platforms have.
And Branko, you must just jump in if you have any comments at any point.
I completely echo what Steve is saying. This is the moment where we need to just rethink the role of media and the role of social media, in the future of a society. And we believe that if the things do not change, something's going to have to break. We are on one side, we have a social media platforms which are on one side playing the role of utility, on the other side they're playing the role of publisher. And they're going to have to make up their mind, because on one side they as Tilly said, they have no responsibility, apart from no costs, no responsibility for what they run on their platforms. At the same time, they're applying algorithm that is pushing content to the people on the platform. And as far as we understand, algorithm is next to publishing, because they are choosing the content based on the data they picked up on a user's behavior. That in itself is a publishing act. And what I personally believe, and I think a lot of people from our industry believe, is that at some stage they're going to have to be either forced to drop the algorithm and assume the role of utility, or they're going to have to be treated the same as other publishers, because apart from having almost no financial cost, they have almost no responsibility in terms of what is published there, and we happen to have all the responsibility. So from literally every angle, every corner, this feels like an unfair relationship for now.
Yeah, and I suppose, the central message, as I understand from you, is the incentives are wrong, or they're skewed in the wrong direction, and there's no regulatory oversight, such as the press, which might otherwise face some wrong incentives too, but there's a code of practice and an ethics behind it to stop those.
We do not object to what they do per se, in terms of what is the business model and what is social media service they're providing to the audience. We just need to understand there's a difference between them being a very good coder and being a provider of the social service. And we believe that where they are playing publishers, they just need to be treated the very same as the other publishers in the market, and they need to be subject to the same regulations and the self-regulations that we have in publishing. So, when somebody publishes, I'll just give you an example. Polly van Wyk, one of our female journalists, every time she would publish an expose against the EFF's leaders in connection with the BS fraud, she would get up to 100 threats of rape per hour on Twitter. And those threats of rape are actually pushed through algorithms to the people who has shown an interest in seeing EFF messages. So essentially, they're being amplified by the Twitter. We did not hear today anyway. And then that is not something that publishers could ever do and could ever and we as a publisher, we would have been immediately taken to task with it. And so we just don't understand why the social media should have a freedom to commit those things and then not suffer any consequences.
And I'm interested in that, and also Stilly's story about the riots. I mean, if you're informing Meta of these threats and that content, and at least Stilly, you said you did inform X in that, and they don't act. I mean, what reason are they giving for not acting?
I was the member of something called Trusted News Initiative, which was created just as a pandemic started. It was a body of made out of editors of large media groups globally, and the task that Trusted News Initiative had was to warn about conspiracy theories, which were starting in those days at earnest. And I informed the body. The parts of the body was also the participants in the body were Google, Facebook, and Twitter in those days, X today. And as the riot started, and as the violent posts by Dudozila Zuma and other people in KwaZulu-Natal were posted freely and followed and retweeted by the networks, I have personally approached the Twitter guys on a group, and I was advised to follow the usual channels to report their behavior, and which I did, and I know a lot of people did, and nothing happened. So after the riots in 2021, I actually resigned from the Trusted News Initiative because that body was actually not effective in any way, and to be honest, I didn't get any response why they would not act to stop the spread of violent rhetoric. I think Stilly has a.
Yeah, if I would have to take a guess, the minute that they step in and get involved in something like that, it opens up a can of worms for them on the moderation front, and then that means that they then have to become they show responsibility in one case. They then have to do that across the board, which then means a massive investment in moderation and cleaning up what gets published on their platform, and that's not something that they really want to do because it costs a lot of money, and it's messy because what is legal in one country is not necessarily legal in another country. What classifies as hate speech doesn't classify as hate speech, and it's a really messy thing. Publishing is really messy and really hard to get right, and it becomes a costly exercise to do so. And this is why they've hid behind Section 230 in the States, which absolves them from being responsible from the content that's published on their platforms, but to the detriment of society. And these are organizations that have made obscene amount of profits and have incredible resources at their disposal, and they just will not go and do this unless they are forced to. And so these practices that we've talked about today contribute to all these negative things, both to society and to the news industry. And why, when a genuine market failure happens and you have these practices happening at the same time that contribute to that market failure, you usually only have two recourses. One is philanthropy and one is policy reform. And there simply isn't enough philanthropy to support the financial aspects. And it's our opinion that policy reform is required to address both the financial aspects of the market failure as well as the practices that have been employed to date.
Branko, did you want to come back in?
I just want to say that the Echo Stilly, if social media platforms were to be brought to our level of responsibility, they would not exist. They would be very, very lousy business. And I think it's really important to understand is that this is we're talking about a failure on many sides to actually understand what's going on here and to understand the difference between a utility and being a publishing company, and they exist in a world where they claim to be one thing at the same time they're bragging and taking profits as though they're another thing. And I think until that field is leveled and until that clear understanding is, and fairness is brought back, I think we have a really, really, really tough picture in front of us.
And the one thing I've been trying to do this week is just also understand the difference between search and social media. I mean, is misinformation a big problem on search, do you think? Or
yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about search, we must also include YouTube as the second biggest search engine in the world as part of that. And so when you look at those two things combined, mis and disinformation is a massive problem because it's not only, let's say, some random person who puts up a blog or a post on a site that's spreading some disinformation. There are rogue publishers themselves who have good search rankings and have over the years built up good search rankings that then effectively weaponize their search rankings to push mis and disinformation. And we see that in South Africa as well as overseas. So the problem is spread across the entire big tech platforms ecosystem. But Facebook, given its social media dominance on that side, is it's hard to say which one is the biggest. You just have to take a sort of best guess by looking at what's on there and what's available to them to combat it. And you can just from anecdotal evidence or personal experience, we could say Meta's probably ahead of this because they also have, more social media dominance, but it is certainly a problem on search too.
Sorry, just to follow up to that, Stilly, in terms of your referral traffic, I mean, what are you most reliant on? I know that you said that you didn't become dependent on social media, but could you give us just a quick breakdown?
Yeah, so Google Discover is probably the largest individual source of traffic. And with search, the two together make up about 50% of our traffic. I'd probably say it's about maybe 35% and 15% Google Discover and Google Search. We have direct traffic to our website and we have our newsletter traffic. Those two together probably make up another, let's say, 30% of our traffic, and then the balance is split across Facebook and which is probably the next biggest one, and maybe around 8%, I would say, around that, a little bit 2-3% from X, and then the others sort of like stuff that comes from all over the web that you're not really quite sure of where it's coming from, or little bits and pieces. But that's probably the 90% split is Google 50%, our own channels 30%, and maybe 10% between mostly Facebook and a little bit of X, and then the rest is kind of split across multiple sources.
Thank you.
And still, you mentioned Google Discover. I mean, I think it was a bit of a surprise for us how big this has got. It maybe shouldn't be a surprise as it's on every Android phone, and with one swipe of the finger you get it. But it's not a Google News, which is not monetized. It is monetized. It's also not search. It's a play in a sense into user retention. It's offering a package. I mean, how do you categorize that, and why it's doing what it's doing in terms of generating traffic and attention, I suppose?
Yeah, so look, we don't have, we don't have any real insight into what does better on Google Discover than, let's say, search. We do know it is different content that does well on Discover. Search has a recency bias in its results. Discover can be older articles. It was, I believe, someone from the Google team described it as being almost set up for magazine type content. And so if you do more of that, it's more likely, or longer form stuff, it's likely to then be promoted in front of people based on their interests across the various Google products, like the Android widget, for example, or the Google app. And so there's multiple avenues for them to promote it based on data that Google has about the individual. And so I think that combination of being, promoted based on interest or based on other bits of data that they have about you has meant it's worked quite well. I think the kind of journalism that we do as well, has also, I guess, in a way, been rewarded by the algorithms at Discover. But we didn't even really know that it was a thing until, we were analyzing our results, and we're like, hey, this thing is now, like, almost overnight, quite a big thing for us.
No, I think we felt the same, and the traffic's often not broken up. It has, it comes from search, but you're right. I think it's got huge. I just wanted to go back quickly to the digital inventory thing. I mean, you're right. You've said these other things have exacerbated, so that is what you say. But just given the volume of inventory, digital inventory, as you said, the price would naturally go down. I mean, in that world, is advertising still a sustainable model for the media? Unlike when it used to be, I suppose there was a lack of industry and advertising rates could support even the public good nature of it. And maybe just, related to that is, we've seen people selling direct and selling. So selling direct, they can get a lot more despite the inventory out there. And I suppose it's the contextual that you're selling about where you're putting your ad. And so is this a failure of that programmatic advertising can't give you context? And apart from the fact it's cheaper and people also want to benefit from that.
Look, we probably may have gotten to this level of where we are now because of the oversupply of inventory, right? We may have gotten there. We certainly have gotten here quicker because of all these other things that we've been talking about today, because it's fed up this price pressure demand. The pressure on price and pushing it down. So we certainly got to this place faster. And then, but no, look, you can make contextual buys, on through programmatic channels. The promise of programmatic was that you could even do direct deals with media buyers. The idea of programmatic was that it would replace picking up the phone call or sending insertion orders via email, and do away with the manual labor related to executing inventory buys as well. So there was also that promise too, but that's never really materialized because it's kind of, there's still so many vague and opaque parts of the programmatic buying process that, it's never direct buys through programmatic haven't really taken off because of some of those issues, as well as people believing they can get cheaper rates elsewhere. Media buyers also playing their role in this, not really driving home or wanting to be accountable if their purchases end up being a third fraudulent and wasted. They'll only be judged on a cost per click or cost per lead, even though even though that might be a fraudulent one. So there's multiple aspects that have sort of sped up the position to where we are today, but underlying all of that is we still get to that place where the work invested in creating a page of journalism is it's not factored into the current market dynamics, and that's, I guess, what you're asking is that would we have gotten to this place anyway, and would we have been screwed anyway? And potentially we would. It would have taken a little bit more time if the practices were decent and not questionable in some cases. If there was more effort in cleaning up all these things we've spoken about today, there may have been a more equitable chance for publishers to survive in the digital ecospace. So it's still, it's not nothing, and it's still an important part of our business. And we have to work harder to maintain the existing levels. Every year it becomes harder to maintain that which has been achieved before. And we have to also come up with new innovations. But I think at the end, we are going to need policy interventions, both in the advertising ecosystem, but also in the journalism sector as a whole, if we're going to keep supporting public interest journalism to survive.
And that's what I thought was different about, I mean, maybe it's implicit in all the other submissions, is you're clear journalism is a public good. Therefore, obviously, the social benefits exceed maybe the commercial aspects. And so your package of remedies, you've looked to government, and I'll come to that. But I was interested that you also singled out business. And I just wanted to understand that a little more, because in your submission, I don't think we unpacked it enough. But explain that maybe in a little more detail to us.
Yeah, so this is something that we struggle with actually, as over the 15 years, almost 15 years that we've been around, is championing the plight of public interest journalism. When we talk about journalism as a public good, we must be specific that public interest journalism, which looks to help protect democratic institutions and help the public make better decisions, is a subset of, I guess, journalism in the broader sense. And so that is certainly a public good. Not all journalism is. But when it is, it does require, there is value to society, and there's value to individuals, and there's value to business. And if I look at the work of public interest journalism in the last decade, and especially in response to state capture, the value that's been created to society works out into the trillions of rands, right? And the problem is that, and that's why it's a real market failure, because that's how valuable the work has been, and yet we find ourselves in a position where we're struggling to sustain public interest journalism around the world. And so this is where we do need regulatory reform and incentives to encourage the behavior, because business is not connecting the dots and saying, actually, our business is 20 to 30% better off or more valuable because of the work of public interest journalism. Can we imagine what the state of the economy would have been if state capture was allowed to continue to run in the way that it did? Can we imagine what the tax system would have been like if Commissioner Tom Moyani was allowed to continue running it in the way that he was, or that finance ministers who were put there for questionable reasons to do questionable things are no longer there, for example? So all these things add up that influence the macroeconomic situation of the country and have been made better because of the work of investigative journalism and other public interest journalism. And so it's highly frustrating that business leaders do not connect those dots and go, actually, why does 95% of our digital budgets need to go to Google and Facebook and leave the country untaxed? Why aren't we allocating even just 10 or 15% of our digital budgets to those people that are helping our economy grow by protecting our democracy and our democratic institutions? And so it's extremely frustrating that when government and business leaders get together and talk about the repair and the recovery of our country, that not one single mention of the market failure of journalism is mentioned and what can be done to support that, either through direct business support or through some of these policy and regulatory and tax interventions that we mentioned before. And so that's why we feel it's highly frustrating that business hasn't played its role as one of the biggest beneficiaries of the work of public interest journalism.
And I suppose that is also down to incentives to chase the cheaper advertising and the free riding on the public good.
Absolutely. And when, the cheaper advertising, if we take into account the fraudulent aspect of this, plus the cost to society, it's not cheaper. It is more expensive. Google will not protect the democratic institutions of South Africa. Google will not investigate state capture. Google will not call out those who are abusing power and allow for change to happen because of that. And so if you take that all into account, it's actually quite short-sighted by business. It is more costly to be sending all this money out of the country and working with, but it takes connecting the dots, it takes vision, it takes getting business leaders to look at the environment beyond just the problems that that businesses have, but to consider this as a whole. And it's really unfortunate and frustrating that we see many of these get-togethers between government and business leaders, and not a single person puts up their hand and says, we have this massive problem that we need to be part of the solution of.
And on government, I mean, again, using your framework, which I think has been very useful for us, because it's a public good, it creates a benefit, but those who create that benefit can't monetize it necessarily. And so you need to put in measures to either change behavior or get incentives for that to be supported. So it seems that's the package that you're looking at there.
Absolutely. And the business case has already been proven. From the work of investigative journalists and whistleblowers in the last couple of years, billions, and we're talking tens of billions of rands have been recovered by the state and the asset forfeiture unit, and fines are now starting to be imposed on people who participated in state capture. And so there is a real business case for the state to put these tax incentives and regulatory incentives in place so that more public interest journalism can be created. And they've already got the money to do it because they've recovered it, right? And so more will bring more. And so it just makes sense. And we have research to back this up in other countries where we've seen that the minute local journalism is destroyed in certain counties in America, the cost of borrowings goes up because immediately the federal government assumes there will be more corruption taking place. There's research like that. We see it but we don't even need to go, to the States. We can see just here by what's been recovered, how valuable public interest journalism is to the country as a whole.
Branko? Branko, you're still on mute.
Branko.
Apologies. I just want to add from the point, which is slightly more difficult to quantify, but I believe it's also extremely crucial, is that, we are facing as civilization globally, and especially in South Africa now, the threat to truth, the threat to not only to from day to day, what is truthful and what is not truthful information. We are facing a threat to actual meaning of truth. And we believe that truth is in the center of every functioning society, and if we can't distinguish truth from lies, we can't maintain our value system. And without our value system, we are as a society, unfortunately, going to crumble. And the four estates of that underpin every democratic society are busy crumbling right now. And what we are doing right now is that we are holding this line between the truth and the lies. And I just want to say that apart from the fact that a lot of money has been wasted, a lot of money has been lost, the civilizational role of the media is being either forgotten or not understood by people in South Africa, people in an important position who should know better. And to me, that is absolutely shocking that we are, because people don't like to hear this story or that story, that they're actually more than happy to go after the entire institutions and entire sector of society. So make no mistake, what's happening now with Google and Facebook and Twitter and others is a massive threat, and it's also a massive part of a greater threat, which is to undermining the system of values. If we don't know what's true and we don't know what's right, we do not have a society.
Yeah, and I suppose, one values holding people to account until it's you who's held to account, and then you no longer value that. But I think it's a good point. I know we've taken a lot of your time. I had one last question just on your approach to the platforms. You say relying on copyright laws and payments for links is not the answer. I don't know if you can just unpack that a little more for us.
Yeah, this is really just in response to some approaches that have happened, or initiatives around the world, where to get to some kind of basis for compensation or remedial action, people have looked either to copyright law or charging to link to our work, and it just doesn't make sense in our approach, because then if you charge to link to news, then you have to charge to link to everything, and it becomes and obviously why the big tech platforms are really against that approach. It just in our world it doesn't make sense, and that's why we think that the environmental rehabilitation framework could be a better way to go, recognizing the importance of public interest journalism to society, and that their practices contributed to the market failure, right? If we're just talking about a simple building a better mousetrap, then fine. That happens. The industries get disrupted all the time, but we also are looking at practices which are dubious, questionable, and potentially unlawful. And so, if they have been they have done that, and they've damaged the environment in which we operate and that news operates, then environmental rehabilitation might be a better framework than something which then has to go and have potentially massive unintended consequences, like opening the copyright law can, or the link tax can, and then you might have either ways for the platforms to say, well, fine, we'll just won't put any links to news on our platforms, and therefore we don't have any links to pay, link tax to pay, or the search traffic, referral traffic completely dries up because they feel that a snippet is violating copyright law. Like, it's useful and it is important for news and public interest journalism to get out as far as possible. So in order to avoid those unintended consequences, and probably something that feels closer to our interpretation of what's happened, rehabilitation framework might be a better way of doing it, and might be a better way of stopping them from absolving themselves, as we see in Australia now, when it's coming to renew those agreements that were initially made a few years ago. They're just, Meta in particular is just saying, well, we'll just stop allowing people to access news completely, and that means we don't have to enter into negotiated settlements. If we had a environmental rehabilitation charge because your practices from the last decade have contributed to this, we could probably say, well, for the next 10 years, regardless of whether you link or not, you're paying this rehabilitation charge, and this is why it's justified. So we think that might be a different way to approach it.
Yeah, and I suppose that was sitting in my head. It seems to create the wrong incentive. If we need to get more news out there because it is the public good, because people need to hear that in itself, but also to fight misinformation and disinformation, then taxing in that way seems to be driving them to do the opposite. The other thing that was sitting in my head is, well, it's often linked to whether or how it's monetized. So it can also just not be monetized, in which case there's very little payment. Or, as we're told, on Google, a lot of the ads go to travel or e-commerce, which may be absolutely correct, but it's a package, and so what ads are coming up on a news page is very little, even according to them, and so it's going to result in meaningless sort of compensation as well.
Yeah, and just lastly on that, James, is that if we apply sort of a minimum rehabilitation charge, for example, and that works out to whatever, it's so easy for them to recover the cost of that rehabilitation because they still are dominant market players, right? So if it ended up being like for example, let's say 2.5 or 3%, on the revenue that they make in the country, like that could very easily be recovered from, again, going back to the stock exchange, there's a straight fee on every transaction that gets processed on the exchange. Like it just becomes part of, doing business, and they could recover it very easily, so that it wouldn't actually even affect their bottom line.
Well, thank you, and I think that's been very insightful, and it's good to have a framework and a thinking. I think it's taken the debate further, and that's what you set out to do today, I think, Stilly and Branko. So thank you very much, and also thanks for the great journalism coming out of the Daily Maverick.
Pleasure, thank you, and thank you for allowing our submissions.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, and that is a wrap up for day 5 and the first week of the digital and media and digital platforms and marketing inquiry, as we have released our schedule for next week, and so we'll see you on Monday morning.